Everyone believed the billionaire's daughter had been born completely blind. For years, no one questioned it. Not the doctors, not the staff, not even her own father. She lived in silence, disconnected from the world, hidden away in a mansion full of secrets. But everything changed the day a new maid was hired. She wasn't a doctor or a specialist, just someone who paid attention. What she noticed during her quiet work around the house would unravel years of lies, challenge a powerful family's past, and bring to light a truth that had been buried since the day the little girl was born. What started as a job turned into a mission, and what she uncovered would shock everyone, especially the man who thought he had done everything to protect his only child. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Richard Wakefield was a powerful man in the agribusiness world, known for building a fortune through hard work and smart decisions. But behind his success, he lived a very different life at home. He stayed in a large, quiet mansion far from the city, where he lived alone with his daughter, Luna. The house was beautiful, with expensive furniture, wide glass windows, and long, empty halls, but it felt cold and lifeless. Richard had lost his wife in a helicopter crash 5 years ago, just days after Luna was born. That tragedy broke something inside him. He had chosen to live far from everyone else, not because he wanted peace, but because he couldn't face the world anymore. His entire life now centered around Luna. She was the only person he truly cared about, and he tried his best to give her everything she needed. But Luna's condition made things hard. From birth, doctors said she was blind. Richard blamed himself, and his days were filled with quiet routines, sadness, and constant worry about her future. Despite the mansion being filled with all kinds of luxuries and tools meant to help, Luna didn't seem to react much to anything. Richard had hired therapists, tutors, and even brought in specialists from around the world, hoping someone could reach her. But nothing changed. Luna rarely spoke. She didn't play. She didn't laugh. Most of her time was spent sitting alone, often by the large living room window, feeling the breeze and listening to distant sounds. Her eyes, though blind, always stared into space, never focusing on anything. It was like she lived in her own world, one that no one else could enter. Richard often sat across the room, silently watching her, feeling helpless. He read to her sometimes, told her stories, even played music, but she rarely reacted. Only once in a while she would tilt her head or frown slightly, and those small gestures were all he had to hold on to. He wondered constantly if she even knew who he was, or if she felt anything at all. At 42 years old, Richard looked older than his age. The sadness had taken a toll on him. His beard was turning grey, and his eyes looked tired most of the time. His movements were slow, thoughtful, like someone always carrying a heavy weight. He had grown distant from friends, cancelled meetings, and passed more business responsibilities to others. He couldn't bring himself to leave Luna for long. Every morning, he followed a strict routine. He helped Luna get dressed, made breakfast, and guided her through the day. He tried different things to connect with her, textures, smells, music, but nothing worked. He had moments of anger, blaming fate, doctors, or himself. He often looked at Luna and whispered apologies, as if she could hear the guilt in his heart. Even with all his money and knowledge, he couldn't fix what he saw as the biggest failure of his life: his daughter's pain and silence. The staff at the mansion was small and discreet. They respected Richard's privacy and barely interacted unless necessary. Most had worked there for years, watching Luna grow without much change. They talked quietly among themselves about her, sharing stories about little things they noticed, how she sometimes hummed softly at night, or how she reached out for the same stuffed toy every evening. But to Richard, those moments felt like tiny drops in a dry well. He wanted more. He wanted her to talk, to smile, to show that she was truly present. Sometimes he sat by her side and just spoke, telling her about his day, about memories of her mother, or even describing things happening outside. He hoped something he said would trigger a response. But Luna stayed mostly quiet, only nodding or slightly turning her head from time to time. Richard clung to those signs, hoping they meant more than they appeared. The house itself had become a symbol of everything Richard had lost. It was big enough for a family, but only 2 people lived there. Each room carried a memory or a piece of hope that never fully arrived. The nursery had never changed. It was still decorated the way his wife had designed it before Luna was born. Soft colors, animal patterns, a rocking chair near the crib. Richard had never touched it after the crash. Sometimes he stood there for a while, holding on to memories he couldn't let go. Luna never showed interest in the room. She didn't explore, didn't ask questions, didn't even seem to understand what it was. Richard had accepted this strange, quiet life, but deep down, he still believed something might change. He read every new study on child development, talked to new doctors, and tried new techniques. But each attempt ended in disappointment. Still, he refused to give up completely. And so the days continued, slow, heavy, and mostly silent. Richard remained committed to Luna, even though he barely slept and rarely felt peace. He still guided her hand during meals, held her gently as they walked through the garden, and whispered bedtime stories with a voice full of pain and love. Luna remained quiet, her face showing little expression, her gaze always blank and distant. Yet every now and then, she would rest her head against his chest, just for a few seconds. Those small moments gave Richard strength to keep going. He didn't know what the future held, but he had made a promise to protect her, no matter what. In that lonely mansion, filled with shadows of the past, Richard Wakefield lived each day for the silent girl who never asked for anything. His daughter Luna, who still sat quietly, always with the same empty gaze. Julia Bennett was 27 years old and had recently gone through one of the hardest moments of her life. She had lost her newborn daughter just a few weeks after birth. The doctors couldn't explain exactly what went wrong, and the days following the loss were filled with confusion, sadness, and silence. Julia lived in a small neighborhood on the outskirts of town. She had no partner, no family nearby, and worked whenever she could to cover her bills. She saw the housekeeping job at the Wakefield mansion in a newspaper ad while sitting in a crowded waiting room. She applied for the position without thinking too much. Part of her just wanted to be somewhere new, far away from the pain that stayed inside her apartment. The mansion was quiet and hidden, with large gates and long driveways. When Julia arrived for the interview, she felt nervous, but focused. She didn't dress fancy, just clean and neat. Richard Wakefield opened the door himself, which surprised her. He looked serious, tired and observant, but not unkind. Richard had interviewed several people for the housekeeping job before. Most had excellent references and professional experience, but something always felt off to him. Either they were too chatty, too cold, or uncomfortable around Luna. When Julia walked in, he noticed her calm posture and quiet eyes. She wasn't trying to impress him, and she didn't speak more than necessary. There was something unusual about her presence. She didn't flinch at the silence in the house. She looked around respectfully, not with curiosity, but with a quiet understanding. During the interview, Richard asked her about her experience, and she answered clearly, though briefly. He noticed the way she spoke, direct and simple, but with a certain softness. At one point she paused and said she had recently lost a child. She didn't give details. Richard nodded, not asking anything else, but that one sentence made him look at her differently. He saw something in her face, a mixture of pain and strength. She wasn't trying to hide either. Julia's first day started early. One of the staff members gave her a short tour of the house and explained the cleaning schedule. Richard was distant but polite. The mansion was large, with many rooms that weren't used often. Julia focused on her work, moving from room to room without making noise. Around midday, she was told she could take a short break in the kitchen. That's when she first saw Luna. The girl sat quietly near a window, holding a small, soft toy. Her head was slightly tilted, and her face looked distant, almost blank. Julia stood at the kitchen door for a moment, watching silently. She had never seen a child so still. There was something about Luna that touched her instantly, not just the fact that she was blind, but the way she seemed disconnected from everything around her. Julia didn't speak. She just sat quietly on the other side of the room and took her break. Even without words, she felt something was different about that child. It wasn't just blindness, it was loneliness. Throughout the next few days, Julia continued her work carefully. She didn't try to force any conversations or ask questions that weren't needed. She cleaned, organized, and followed the instructions given to her. But she began to notice small details about Luna. The girl rarely responded to sounds, but she would sometimes pause and slightly turn her head when Julia entered the room. Once, while dusting the shelves, Julia dropped a cloth. The soft thump made Luna flinch just a little. Julia apologized softly, even though she knew Luna couldn't see her. Over time, Julia realized that Luna responded more to calm, steady movements and soft voices. She also noticed that the staff kept their distance from Luna, doing their best to avoid disturbing her. Julia, however, felt pulled toward the girl in a way she couldn't fully explain. She didn't see Luna as broken or strange. She saw a child who needed more than care. She needed connection. And Julia, carrying the weight of her own loss, began to feel a quiet sense of purpose. One afternoon, while Julia was folding linens in the hallway near Luna's room, she heard a small sound. It was a quiet hum, almost like a whisper. Curious, she paused and listened. It was Luna. She was sitting on the floor, not far from her door, humming a tune that had no clear melody. Julia didn't interrupt. She simply sat nearby, continuing her task. After a few minutes, Luna stopped humming. Then she slowly crawled toward the hallway, her small hands searching for the wall. Julia stood up quietly and offered her hand without saying anything. Luna's hand stopped mid-air and hovered near Julia's. Then carefully, Luna touched her fingers to Julia's. That moment, though brief, felt incredibly important. Julia didn't speak or cry. She just let Luna hold her hand for a moment. That silent contact told her more than any words. It meant trust, or at least curiosity. From that point on, Julia made sure to pass by Luna more often, not to disturb her, but just to be present. Richard noticed the change, even though Julia didn't say anything. He saw that Luna started moving slightly more during the day. She no longer spent all her time near the window. Sometimes she sat in the hallway or near the kitchen where Julia could be seen working. Richard asked Julia one evening how things were going. She replied honestly, saying that Luna reminded her of someone she lost, but she didn't want to replace anyone. She just wanted to help. Richard didn't respond right away. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He wasn't someone who trusted easily, but he could tell Julia wasn't pretending. There was no pity in her actions, just quiet attention and genuine care. That night, after Julia had gone to her room, Richard stood outside Luna's door for a while. He watched his daughter sleep and noticed a slight change in her breathing. Deeper, calmer. For the first time in a long while, something had shifted in the house. Julia's arrival hadn't fixed anything, but it had started something new. Julia was dusting the shelves in Luna's room, taking her time and working quietly. She always tried not to disturb the girl, especially when Luna was sitting in her usual corner, holding the same worn-out teddy bear. Julia had learned that Luna preferred silence, or at least calm surroundings. But that day, as she reached behind a wooden chest to clean, she suddenly stopped. She heard something. Soft, almost like a whisper. At first, she thought she imagined it. She turned slightly and looked at Luna. The little girl was gently moving her lips, murmuring something while hugging the teddy bear close to her chest. Julia leaned in, just enough to listen. Luna's voice was slow and barely audible, but it was real. She wasn't just making sounds, she was speaking, though the words weren't clear. Julia stayed quiet, not wanting to interrupt. Her eyes focused on Luna's face, and something about her expression caught Julia's attention. There was emotion there. The girl wasn't simply blind and disconnected. There was more happening beneath the surface. Julia slowly backed away and sat on the small armchair near the dresser. From that angle, she could watch Luna without making her nervous. As Luna continued to whisper softly, Julia noticed something strange. Luna's head moved slightly every time there was a sound, a creak on the floor, the shift of a curtain, the distant hum of a vacuum cleaner. Luna reacted to all of it with subtle, accurate movements. Her ears were tuned in with such detail, it felt like she could map out the entire room just by listening. Julia watched in silence, trying not to jump to conclusions, but the girl's reactions seemed almost too sharp for someone who had never seen before. Julia got up slowly and walked across the rug. Luna's head turned in her direction before she even reached the center of the room. The girl didn't speak, but she clearly sensed the movement. Julia placed a toy on the floor and nudged it gently. Luna's body shifted again, this time toward the exact spot where the sound came from. Julia started testing things gently. She opened a small drawer, then closed it slowly. She stepped lightly and then tapped her shoe. Each time Luna reacted, it was small, sometimes just a twitch of the head or a tilt of the chin, but it was always accurate. Julia began to wonder if Luna was using only her hearing, or if there was something else. She decided to try a few toys. Some had sound buttons, others had textures, but one toy she picked up had flashing lights. She turned it on and aimed it toward the wall by accident. Luna didn't respond. That made sense, she thought. Luna was blind after all. But then Julia took out her phone to check the time and accidentally turned on the flashlight. The beam of light crossed in front of Luna's face for just a second. In that moment, Julia thought she saw a movement. Luna's eyelids twitched. Her pupils shifted slightly. It was fast and faint, but it happened. Julia's heart jumped and she stood still, watching closely. Not sure of what she had just seen, Julia turned the flashlight off and waited a moment. Then she turned it on again and gently waved her phone side to side in front of Luna's face. The girl didn't move her head, but her eyes flickered again, as if they were trying to follow something. It wasn't strong or focused, but it was there, some kind of reaction. Julia moved a little closer and repeated the motion. Luna's expression didn't change, but her eyes moved slightly again, following the light's path just for a second. Julia stepped back and sat down, confused and surprised. Could Luna actually see something, even just a small amount of light? She wasn't a doctor, but this didn't feel like the response of someone fully blind. It didn't make sense. The doctors had said Luna was completely blind from birth. Julia thought hard. Maybe it was a reflex. Maybe it was just chance. But she had been around Luna enough to know the difference between chance and reaction, and this felt real. A sudden chill ran through Julia's body. She looked at Luna, who was now sitting quietly again, gently rubbing her fingers over the bear's ear. The girl looked calm and unaware of what had just happened. Julia didn't know what to do. Should she tell Richard right away? Should she wait and try again later to be sure? A lot of thoughts ran through her mind. She didn't want to give anyone false hope. But at the same time, she couldn't ignore what she saw. It wasn't just a feeling, it was movement, reaction, something that hadn't happened before. Julia turned off her flashlight and tucked the phone into her pocket. She sat quietly and just watched Luna for a few more minutes. The little girl started whispering again, holding her bear close, her lips moving slowly. Julia stayed there, still and silent, feeling a strange mix of fear, curiosity, and something else, hope. For the first time, it felt like something new might be possible, something no one had expected. As the room grew quieter, Julia finished cleaning the last corner near Luna's bookshelf. Her mind was still racing, trying to make sense of what she had just seen. She looked at Luna once more before stepping out of the room. The girl was now sitting in the same position, holding the teddy bear and whispering softly to herself. Julia watched her for a moment longer, frozen in thought. She didn't want to assume anything yet, but something had changed that day, something important. Whether it was light, movement, or just a reaction, it was enough to make Julia stop and feel a spark of possibility. She gently closed the door behind her and walked down the hallway, planning her next steps. Maybe she'd try again tomorrow with another light. Maybe she'd talk to Richard carefully without causing alarm. But for now, she kept it to herself. Back in Luna's room, the girl sat still, hugging her bear and whispering words only she could hear, while Julia held on to the moment that had just passed. Julia couldn't get the moment with the flashlight out of her mind. She had seen Luna's eyes move, not once, but twice. The motions were slight, but they were there. It didn't match what she'd been told about Luna's condition. The girl was supposed to be completely blind since birth. That's what the doctors had said. That's what Richard believed. But Julia had seen something different, and now she needed to know more. The next morning, after finishing her usual chores, she returned to Luna's room while the girl sat in her regular spot on the soft rug near the window. Julia acted casually, dusting the nearby shelves, folding a blanket, moving around like any other day. Then, without making a sound, she slowly pushed the window open just a little. A breeze entered the room. Nothing strong, just a light change in the air and brightness. Luna turned her head slightly in that direction, not sharply, but definitely. Julia stood still. That was not a sound. That was not a touch. It was a reaction to light, or something close to it. Later that day, Julia tried another small experiment. She waited until Luna was sitting calmly in the hallway, holding her teddy bear as usual. Julia grabbed her phone again and turned on the flashlight, pretending to be fixing something near a cabinet. Then she slowly moved her hand back and forth between the light and Luna's face, casting clear shadows. She did this several times, making sure not to make any noise or sudden movement. Luna didn't react right away, but after a few seconds, her eyes followed one of the shadows. It was a small movement, almost like a reflex. Julia repeated it carefully, slower this time. Again, Luna's gaze shifted, barely, but it did. Julia's heart started to beat faster. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. There was a connection between Luna's eyes and the light changes. It wasn't focused vision, but it wasn't nothing either. Julia sat down across the hall afterward and wrote down everything she had seen. She wanted to keep track of every test, every reaction. The next few days were filled with more quiet experiments. Julia never talked to anyone about what she was doing. She didn't want to alarm Richard or make him think she was crossing boundaries. But deep down, she believed something wasn't right. She continued to test Luna's responses carefully, slow flashes of light, quick movements, changes in brightness, and Luna kept reacting, just a little each time. These reactions weren't strong or consistent, but they kept happening. That was enough to convince Julia she wasn't imagining it. One afternoon, while tidying up the bathroom cabinets, Julia noticed a wooden box placed behind some towels. Curious, she pulled it out. Inside were several small bottles of eye drops. The labels were partially peeled off, but she could read the name of the doctor, an older name, no longer familiar to her. Each bottle had dates going back several years. There were no clear instructions, no reason listed, only the dosage. They had clearly been used for a long time, maybe daily. Julia checked the dates again. Something didn't feel right. She took one of the bottles and looked at it closely. It didn't look like the usual allergy or dryness drops she had seen before. There were scientific terms she didn't recognize. She searched the name of the medicine discreetly on her phone when no one was around, and what she found made her stomach turn. The compound was used in treatments that reduced eye pressure, but had also been reported in rare cases to affect pupil response and even light sensitivity if used long-term, especially in children. There was no information about why Luna had been using them, or if she even needed them. Julia started to wonder if someone had made a mistake, or worse, if Luna had been misdiagnosed. Could the drops have been blocking some of her natural vision all this time? Julia couldn't answer that yet, but she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't normal. She put the bottles back exactly where she found them and made a note of everything she saw. Her concern was growing, and so were her questions. That night, Julia lay in bed thinking about what to do. She didn't want to accuse anyone of anything. Maybe there was a real medical reason for the eye drops. Maybe the doctor had a plan. But if Luna could actually see light or shadows, even slightly, someone needed to know. Julia thought about telling Richard, but she hesitated. He was careful and protective. He trusted the past doctors and believed in Luna's diagnosis. Bringing this up without proof could cause tension. Still, keeping it a secret didn't feel right either. Luna deserved to be understood. She deserved a real chance. Julia felt more responsible for her now, more connected to her progress and her truth. She decided she would continue her observations for a few more days, keeping detailed notes. Then she would decide how to approach Richard. But in her heart, she already knew something had been missed. Something important. Luna's reactions weren't random. They were clues, and Julia had to keep following them no matter how complicated things became. In the following days, Julia continued to behave normally around Richard and the staff, but her attention stayed focused on Luna. She carefully watched every moment the girl reacted to light or movement. She repeated her quiet tests, changing only one thing at a time, just like she'd read in an article about behavioral observations. Every time Luna showed even a slight response, Julia wrote it down. She tested different times of day, different rooms, and various light sources. And almost every time Luna responded, barely, but clearly. Julia also kept watching the cabinet where the eye drops were stored. Every morning, one of the older staff members brought them to Luna's room and gave her the drops without much explanation. Julia made note of the routine. Luna didn't fight it. She was used to it. But Julia couldn't ignore the growing suspicion. If these drops were part of the problem, they needed to be questioned. She still didn't know how to bring it up to Richard, but the idea that something had been hiding in plain sight all along was now impossible to ignore. A silent alarm had been triggered. Julia had waited long enough. After days of silent tests and notes, and after observing Luna react to different types of light and movement, she felt ready for one final step. The quiet doubt that had started as a passing thought had now grown into something bigger, an undeniable need to know the truth. She waited until the house was calm and still. The staff had finished their duties, and Richard had gone into his office for the evening. Julia found Luna sitting cross-legged on the rug in her room, gently rocking her teddy bear. The girl seemed relaxed, her usual blank expression resting on her face. Julia sat across from her and gently pulled a small flashlight from her pocket. She looked at Luna carefully, making sure she didn't startle her. "Luna," she said softly, "I'm going to shine a little light. Tell me if you feel anything, okay?" Luna didn't answer, but she stayed still. Slowly, gently, Julia raised the flashlight and pointed it straight into Luna's eyes, her heart pounding with fear and hope at the same time. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Luna's eyes stayed open, motionless, and Julia thought maybe this had been a mistake. But then, out of nowhere, Luna blinked. It was slow, almost like she was confused by something. Then she blinked again, this time faster, as if reacting to the brightness. Julia felt her breath catch in her throat. She kept the light steady and leaned forward slightly. "Luna, can you feel that?" she whispered. The room was completely silent except for the sound of their breathing. Luna tilted her head, her eyebrows tightening just a little. Then in the smallest, most fragile voice, she said something Julia wasn't ready for. "I think I saw a light. Mommy." The words were broken and shaky, like she wasn't sure she was saying them right. Julia froze. She couldn't believe what she'd just heard. It wasn't just that Luna might be able to see something. It was the word mommy. Luna had never called anyone that before, not even once. Julia's eyes filled with tears immediately. That single word broke something open inside Julia. All the weight she had been carrying since the loss of her own baby came rushing back at once, but now mixed with something new, purpose. Luna had reached out in the only way she knew how. It wasn't just a test anymore. It wasn't just light or shadows. It was a connection. Luna had responded not only to what she saw, but to what she felt in that moment. Julia didn't know if Luna had confused her with her real mother, or if the word had simply come out by accident. But it didn't matter. Julia leaned forward and gently placed her hand on Luna's shoulder. "I'm here," she said, her voice trembling. "You're safe." Luna didn't pull away. She stayed still, then slowly leaned forward until her head rested lightly against Julia's chest. It was a small gesture, but for Julia, it meant everything. It wasn't just a test that had worked. It was the beginning of something completely new, something powerful, something real. Julia stayed like that for several minutes, holding Luna without saying anything else. She didn't want to break the moment. The little girl who had been silent, still, and unresponsive for so long had just spoken, softly, uncertainly, but clearly. And it wasn't just what she said. It was how she said it. There was emotion in her voice, a kind of confusion mixed with hope, like she was reaching for something she didn't fully understand. Julia could feel her own heartbeat speeding up as her arms gently wrapped around Luna. In her mind, 100 questions started racing. What did this mean? How much could Luna actually see? How long had she been feeling these things but not expressing them? And what about the eye drops? Julia didn't have all the answers, but she had something even stronger. A decision. From that moment forward, she knew her role wasn't just cleaning and taking care of the house. It was protecting Luna, no matter what. Whatever was going on in this house, she couldn't ignore it anymore. When Luna finally pulled away, she looked calmer, even if her face still held that faraway look. Julia wiped her own eyes and smiled gently. "You're very brave," she whispered. Luna didn't say anything else, but she seemed more aware, more present than before. Julia carefully turned off the flashlight and slid it back into her pocket. Her hands were still shaking. She knew this wasn't something she could explain easily to Richard, not without him asking a lot of questions. But she also knew something important had just happened, something that couldn't be ignored or forgotten. Julia had come to this house hoping for work, trying to escape her own grief. But now she had found a new purpose, a reason to stay. Luna wasn't just a quiet child with a medical condition. She was a girl trying to connect, trying to understand a world she hadn't fully experienced yet. Julia realized that from this point forward, her job would be much more than just housework. She had to protect that connection. She had to protect Luna. As Julia stood up, she gently kissed the top of Luna's head and helped her lie down for rest. The girl held her teddy bear close again, but stayed quiet. Julia pulled the blanket over her and sat by her side for a few minutes, just watching. Her mind was filled with thoughts, but her heart had already made the choice. Whatever had caused Luna's blindness, and whatever the truth was behind those eye drops or the years of silence, Julia was going to find out. But she would do it carefully, step by step. For now, Luna had spoken, and that meant everything. She had whispered a truth in the form of a sentence so simple and yet so deep. "I think I saw a light, Mommy." That was the moment it all changed. It wasn't just about medicine or diagnosis anymore. It was about trust, safety, and something like love. As Julia turned off the lights and left the room, she carried that sentence in her chest like a promise. She would protect Luna at all costs. Julia was standing in Luna's room, kneeling beside the small rug, holding the flashlight again. She knew she was risking a lot by doing this, but after what had happened, the blinking, the whispered sentence, the word "Mommy," she couldn't just stop. She needed to be sure. So she aimed the light gently toward Luna's eyes, moving it slowly to see if there would be another reaction. Luna blinked again, just like before, and turned her head slightly as if following the brightness. Julia felt her heart race, but before she could speak, a loud voice came from the hallway. "What are you doing?" It was Richard. He stepped into the room quickly, his face red with anger and confusion. "What is that in your hand?" he shouted. Julia froze, trying to explain, but Richard grabbed the flashlight from her and stared at her with disbelief. "Are you experimenting with my daughter?" he asked harshly. Before Julia could defend herself, Luna suddenly stood up and for the first time in her life ran straight toward someone. She ran to Julia. Luna wrapped her arms around Julia's waist and held on tightly. Her small body trembled, and she didn't say anything at first. Richard was completely stunned. He had never seen his daughter move like that, never seen her walk with purpose, let alone run. "Luna," he said, unsure of what was happening. The girl stayed quiet for a moment, still holding Julia. Then with a small, shaking voice, she said the words that would change everything. "I saw a light." Richard blinked, completely confused. "What did you say?" he asked. Luna turned her head slightly toward his voice and repeated it. "I saw a light." Julia stayed silent, letting the moment speak for itself. Richard looked at both of them, overwhelmed. For years he had believed that his daughter was blind without question, but now she was talking, reacting, and reaching for someone. He couldn't ignore it. Slowly, without saying much else, he nodded and spoke in a low voice. "Stop giving her the eye drops, at least for now." Julia simply nodded, her heart pounding with relief. The following days were filled with quiet changes. Julia stopped giving Luna the drops, exactly as Richard allowed. The first day passed without anything noticeable, but by the second, something began to shift. Luna started responding to light more frequently, especially sunlight. Julia opened the curtains during the morning, and Luna turned her head toward the bright window. It wasn't just random movement. She paused and kept her face in that direction for several minutes, almost as if enjoying the light. Richard stood silently at the door that morning, watching with a mixture of doubt and hope. Later that afternoon, Julia sat down with Luna using simple flashcards, just big white cards with black shapes, a circle, a square, a triangle. Slowly, she held each one up. At first, Luna did nothing. But then, after a long pause, she lifted her hand and pointed toward the circle. Julia gasped quietly. Richard, watching from behind, stepped closer. "She saw that," he whispered. Julia nodded. It was small, but it meant something huge. It meant they were finally heading in the right direction. Each day brought something new. The progress was slow but steady. Julia stayed consistent, working patiently with Luna through small games and simple visual tasks. Luna reacted more often now, not only to lights, but to objects. One afternoon, Julia placed 3 toys in front of her, a soft ball, a toy car, and a plastic duck. Without saying anything, she nudged the duck gently, and Luna smiled. Then she pointed at it. Richard was nearby, and for a few seconds he said nothing. He just watched, his eyes full of surprise. "She's choosing," he said quietly. Julia nodded again. "Yes, she's seeing." That night, Luna sat with Julia by the window, and instead of just staring blankly, she began asking small questions. "What color is that?" she asked, pointing toward a blanket. It shocked them both. Julia answered softly, and Luna asked again, about other things. Richard stood near the doorway again, not saying a word. For a man who had lived with hopelessness for years, the sudden spark of progress left him speechless. He began to believe again. One morning, as sunlight filled the hallway, Luna walked toward the brightness without help. She didn't stumble or hesitate. She moved with quiet confidence, stretching her hand out toward the light coming through the window. Julia followed slowly behind her, not interrupting. Richard had been in his office, but came out when he heard footsteps. He stopped when he saw Luna standing near the light, one hand on the glass, the other holding her teddy bear. "She's not afraid anymore," Julia said gently. Richard didn't answer. He sat down nearby, his face pale. "I don't know how we missed it all these years," he finally said. Julia stayed quiet, stayed. There was no easy answer. Maybe it was the wrong diagnosis, maybe it was the medicine, or maybe no one had paid close enough attention. But now, none of that mattered. What mattered was Luna's progress. Her smiles became more frequent. Her eyes started to look toward faces. And sometimes, in quiet moments, she would reach out and touch Julia's face, like she was trying to memorize her features. By the end of the week, the atmosphere in the mansion had changed completely. It was no longer silent and heavy. It felt lighter, more alive. Luna now responded to colors, shapes, even simple gestures. She smiled more. She laughed softly when Julia tickled her or told silly stories. She had stopped whispering to herself as much, and instead began asking questions out loud. Richard, though still distant at times, started sitting with them during these moments. He no longer watched from a distance. He started participating, showing Luna old family photo albums and asking her if she could make anything out. One afternoon, Luna squinted at a picture of her mother and asked, "Who is that lady in the red dress?" Richard cried quietly, not from pain, but from the shock of hearing his daughter notice something visual, something real. Julia sat beside them, quietly holding Luna's hand. The journey wasn't over. There were still questions and doubts, but one thing was certain: Luna was changing. And it all began the day she said, "I saw a light." Luna's improvements had been real. They weren't her imagination, and they didn't happen by chance. Everything had changed the moment they stopped using the eye drops. That couldn't be ignored. She needed answers, real ones. So one evening after Luna had gone to sleep, Julia took one of the small glass bottles from the cabinet where the drops were stored. She placed it in a plastic bag and hid it carefully in her purse. The next morning, while Richard was still in a call, Julia stepped out for a few hours. She drove to a nearby city where she had arranged to meet someone from her past. Her name was Sophia, an old friend from nursing school, who was now doing her residency in ophthalmology. They hadn't spoken in years, but when Julia explained briefly what was going on, Sophia agreed to help. They met at a small diner near the hospital. Julia handed over the bottle, explaining everything that had happened with Luna. Sophia promised to run the tests quickly. A few days later, Julia received a call. It was Sophia, and her voice was tense. "You need to come," she said. Julia drove straight to the hospital, her stomach tight the entire time. When she arrived, Sophia brought her to a quiet office and closed the door. She held the bottle of drops in her hand and pointed to a printed lab report on the table. "These aren't normal eye drops," she began. "There's a compound in here, cyclopentalate, but in extremely high doses. This chemical causes pupil contraction and inhibits light response. In normal doses, it's used to treat certain eye conditions, but this formula is different. It's aggressive. Prolonged use, especially in children, could easily cause temporary vision loss or even convince someone that they're blind." Julia stared at the report, her heart pounding. "You're saying the drops made her blind?" Sophia nodded. "Yes. And if she was never completely blind to begin with, these drops would have erased what little sight she had. Julia felt sick. She covered her mouth and sat down, stunned. Julia asked Sophia if this kind of thing could happen by mistake. Maybe someone had mixed up prescriptions or used an outdated treatment. But Sophia shook her head. No, this isn't a mistake. This formula was intentional. Someone designed it to restrict vision. Julia looked at the report again and froze when she saw the name printed in the corner of the document. Prescribed by Dr. Atticus Morrow. Her eyes widened. That was Luna's doctor. He had treated her since birth. Julia remembered the name from the labels on Luna's old records and medication bottles. She couldn't believe it. How is this even allowed? She asked. Sophia frowned. I've heard of him. A few years ago, there were rumors about malpractice lawsuits filed against him in several states. I thought he had stopped practicing. Julia felt dizzy. If this man had knowingly prescribed medication that made Luna blind, or kept her that way, then something horrible had been done. She thanked Sophia, took the report, and left the hospital. On the way back to the mansion, her hands shook at the steering wheel. That evening, Julia sat down with Richard in his office. She placed the lab report in front of him and waited while he read it. His expression changed slowly, from confusion to disbelief, and then to something darker. When he saw the name Dr. Atticus Morrow in bold print, he stood up abruptly and walked to the window, silent for a long time. This can't be real, he said finally. He treated Luna since she was a newborn. He told me she had no retinal response, that her optic nerve was underdeveloped. He convinced me she would never see anything. Julia stayed calm, explaining everything Sophia had said. The chemical, the purpose, the risks. It all pointed to one conclusion. Luna had not been born completely blind, and the drops had made her condition worse. Richard sat back down, visibly shaken. I trusted him, he muttered. I followed every instruction. Julia reached across the table. You didn't know, but now we do. Richard nodded slowly. Then we have to find him. We have to know why he did this. First to old colleagues, then to medical offices in the state, and finally to the licensing board. Everyone gave him the same kind of answer. Dr. Atticus Morrow hadn't practiced medicine in years. His license had been suspended after a series of lawsuits involving other children. Cases that had never made national news, but were serious enough to push him out of the profession. In each case, the families had reported strange prescriptions, inconsistent diagnoses, and long-term damage. Richard felt sick to his stomach. He realized he had never truly questioned the treatment Luna was receiving. After his wife died, he had simply accepted what the doctor said, trusting his word without thinking deeper. Now he understood that trust had been broken in the worst possible way. Julia continued her own research online, finding a few articles on obscure blogs and forums written by angry parents. One post mentioned Morrow leaving town quietly, avoiding court by settling privately. The more they learned, the clearer it became. He had vanished. Richard and Julia sat in silence that evening, both overwhelmed. Luna was asleep upstairs, unaware of the storm that was now unraveling around her past. Richard held the lab report in one hand and a photo of Luna in the other. He stole years from her, he said quietly. Years she could have been seeing, learning, living. Julia nodded, her voice calm but steady. But she's not lost anymore. She's gaining it back, slowly. Richard looked at her, and for the first time, the hardness in his face seemed to fade. You saved her, he said. Julia shook her head. We still have a long way to go. Richard agreed. He promised they would keep searching for Morrow, even if it took months. They needed closure. They needed justice. But most of all, they needed to rebuild Luna's future on honest ground this time. As the night settled in, both of them felt the weight of what had been uncovered. The truth had finally come to light. And from this point forward, there was no turning back. Richard and Julia agreed it was time to speak out. The truth about Dr. Morrow couldn't stay hidden. Richard contacted a journalist he had trusted in the past, someone known for careful, respectful reporting. Together, they started organizing medical records, test results, and all the documents proving Luna had been given dangerous medication for years. Julia also wrote a statement about her discovery and involvement. They didn't want fame or drama. They just wanted the truth exposed so that no other child would suffer the same. But soon after the story was shared with the journalist, strange things started happening. The following day, a new article appeared online. Not about Morrow, but about Richard. The headline suggested he had ignored professional advice for Luna's treatment for years and had refused important therapies. It painted him as a careless father. Richard was shocked. None of it was true. Julia tried to contact the journalist, but they said the piece didn't come from them. Someone had leaked false information to discredit Richard before the real story came out. As they tried to control the situation, things got worse. Julia began receiving strange messages on her phone from an unknown number. At first they were vague, saying things like, "You should stop, and it's not your business." But then they became more direct. "Stay out of this, or we'll make sure you regret it." Julia told Richard immediately. He wanted to call the police, but Julia wasn't sure if that would help. There was no name, no face behind the threats. They both realized that someone didn't want the truth about Dr. Morrow going public. Maybe it was the doctor himself, maybe someone connected to him. Either way, they couldn't back down. Richard's legal team began investigating the source of the false news articles. They contacted web hosts and traced IP addresses, but everything led to private servers or untraceable sources. The situation was stressful, but it made one thing very clear. Someone was scared of what they were about to reveal. That fear meant the truth was even more important than they thought. Despite the chaos happening outside, something amazing was happening inside the mansion. Luna had been taken for a full vision reassessment by a trusted specialist. The results confirmed what Julia and Richard already suspected. Luna had partial functional vision. Her sight wasn't perfect, and it would likely never be completely normal. But she could detect light, identify shapes, and react to movement. The specialist explained that with regular visual stimulation sessions, Luna could improve her ability to process what she saw. Julia and Richard set up daily activities to help with that. They used colorful toys, movement-based games, and spent time in sunlit rooms. Luna responded well. She didn't seem scared or confused, just curious. She pointed to colors when asked, followed moving objects with her eyes, and even started recognizing differences between day and night. These small changes filled the house with new energy. The staff, once silent and reserved, now smiled more often. There was a sense of hope again. Luna was proving everyone wrong. She was learning to see, little by little. One afternoon, Julia placed a set of crayons and paper in front of Luna. She didn't explain much, just told her that these were colors and she could do anything she wanted with them. Luna touched each crayon, feeling their shape. Then she picked the yellow one and pressed it to the paper, unsure at first. The line she drew was shaky, uneven, but it was her first. Julia watched closely. Luna kept drawing, slow, scattered lines across the page. When she finished, she smiled and held up the paper. "Is it good?" she asked. Julia hugged her tightly. It wasn't about the drawing. It was about what it meant. This was a girl who, just weeks ago, hadn't spoken much and barely reacted to anything. Now she was expressing herself in a new way. Richard walked in and saw the drawing. He didn't speak at first. He knelt down beside her and said, "It's beautiful." Luna smiled again and started drawing another one. It became a new daily routine, drawing, exploring colors, and slowly understanding the world around her. Outside the mansion, the pressure continued. More articles were posted online. accusing Richard of being careless with past business decisions. One even claimed Julia had faked Luna's progress to gain attention. They knew none of it was real, but that didn't stop people from reading it. Social media accounts connected to Morrow's past clinics stayed silent, not confirming or denying anything. The smear campaign had clearly been planned, and now Richard's team believed they knew why. Someone feared a lawsuit or public exposure. Even with the lies spreading, Richard and Julia refused to give in. They continued moving forward with their story, sharing verified documents with legal teams and medical boards. Julia also met with 2 other families who had suspicions about Morrow's past treatments. Their children had experienced similar issues. That information gave Julia more confidence that they weren't alone. They had uncovered something bigger than Luna's case. It was a pattern, and it had to be stopped. But they also agreed not to rush. Luna's well-being came first, and they would protect her no matter what. Despite everything trying to stop them, Luna's world was growing. She began naming colors on her own: red, blue, green. Her favorite was yellow. She said it made her feel happy. Julia continued reading to her, pointing at pictures and helping her trace shapes with her fingers. Richard joined them every night, and the 3 of them formed a quiet routine that brought calm in the middle of the storm. The mansion didn't feel as lonely anymore. There were still challenges to face, threats, lies, and legal risks, but they didn't seem as heavy with Luna laughing and showing her drawings proudly. Her progress gave them strength. On one of her drawings, she wrote her name for the first time with help. Julia taped it to the kitchen wall. "This is just the beginning," she said. Richard agreed. They still had a long road ahead, but they weren't afraid of it anymore. The attacks would come and go, but the truth they had uncovered couldn't be erased. And Luna, once thought to be lost in darkness, was finally seeing her future. With all the lab reports, testimonies, and documents collected, Richard and Julia decided it was finally time to take formal action. They scheduled a meeting with the district attorney's office. Richard didn't use his connections or lawyers. He walked in like any other citizen. Julia came with him, carrying a folder with all the printed reports, including the toxicology results, prescription history, and the testimonies from the other families who had experienced similar situations. They were received by a young but serious prosecutor who listened carefully as they explained what had happened to Luna. When the name Dr. Atticus Morrow came up, the prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "You're not the first to bring him up," he said. That single sentence gave Richard and Julia hope. Over the next few weeks, the district attorney's office began its investigation. Phone calls were made, records were pulled, and subpoenas were issued. Then, something shocking was discovered. Dr. Morrow had signed private contracts with pharmaceutical companies. These deals gave him access to experimental compounds, many of which had never passed proper clinical trials. The files revealed that Dr. Morrow had used his position as a pediatric specialist to conduct unofficial trials on children, prescribing eye treatments that weren't yet approved. In return, he received financial bonuses, trips, and under-the-table compensation from the companies funding the studies. Some of the contracts were encrypted, but investigators were able to match product codes from the pharmaceutical companies to the ingredients found in Luna's eye drops. It was all there. Dates, names, transactions, even signatures. Richard was furious. Julia was sickened. They had suspected something bad, but not this level of deception. When this evidence was brought to light, the district attorney approved the opening of a formal criminal case. Soon after, the media picked up the story. At first, it started on local news, child's vision blocked by illegal drug trials. But then, national outlets followed. Interviews were requested, headlines spread, and with the story gaining attention, more families began to come forward. Parents who had seen unexplained changes in their children's vision started to ask questions. The truth had finally come out. The public reaction was intense. Online forums were filled with parents sharing similar stories. Some described how their children were prescribed the same drops by Morrow and had shown no improvement or even worsened symptoms. A few families said they had tried to report him in the past, but were ignored or pressured into silence. Now, with national eyes on the case, silence was no longer an option. Julia became an unexpected spokesperson. Reporters asked for interviews, and though she was nervous at first, she agreed to speak. She didn't want fame. She just wanted to tell the truth. She talked about how she met Luna, what she had observed, and how small details led her to question everything. Her calm, honest way of speaking touched people. Viewers saw her not just as a caregiver, but as someone who had done what no one else dared. Her face was shown on screens across the country with headlines like "Nanny Who Uncovered the Truth" and "Julia Bennett, a voice for the voiceless." Her life had completely changed. Richard also received attention, but he avoided the spotlight as much as possible. He did attend court hearings and gave statements to the investigators, but he didn't want to become the center of the story. For him, it was about Luna, and about all the children who had been hurt. His guilt ran deep. For years, he had trusted Morrow without question. He had believed his daughter's blindness was unchangeable, but now, each day he spent with Luna reminded him how much had been stolen from her. Still, something had changed in him. He wasn't just a grieving father anymore. He was active, alert, and involved. He made sure Luna got the best visual therapy available. He followed every update in the case, and in quiet moments, he spoke to Julia not just as a caretaker, but as someone he admired deeply. She had done what he couldn't. He respected her strength and her persistence. Slowly, without planning it, a bond began to grow between them. It wasn't romantic at first, but it was steady. It was real. At home, Luna continued making progress. Her vision wasn't perfect, but she was learning fast. She could now recognize simple objects, match colors, and follow movements in bright rooms. She was more talkative, asking questions about things she hadn't been able to experience before. "Is that the color blue?" she'd ask, pointing at the sky. "Or what's that shape?" While touching the edge of a book. Julia and Richard answered every question with care. They created a structured routine that included games, drawing, visual exercises, and quiet reading time. The atmosphere in the mansion was completely different from what it had been months ago. There was laughter now, and movement, and a sense of purpose. Staff members were more relaxed. The house didn't feel like a museum anymore. It felt like a home. On several occasions, Julia found herself smiling at Richard during dinner, and he'd smile back, saying nothing but understanding everything. It wasn't just about Luna anymore. Their shared fight for her had created something deeper between them, something that didn't need to be explained yet. By the time the case officially went to trial, public support was strong. Dozens of families testified. The pharmaceutical companies denied involvement at first, but evidence made it impossible to hide. Dr. Morrow, finally located in another state under a false identity, was arrested and brought to court. His trial became a symbol of the importance of medical ethics. Julia testified calmly, clearly, explaining her discoveries and actions step by step. Richard also testified, admitting his blind trust and failure to question Morrow sooner. The court respected their honesty. Luna didn't appear in court, but her drawings were submitted as part of the evidence. Proof of progress. When the guilty verdict was announced, it felt like justice had finally arrived. The crowd outside the courthouse clapped. Julia and Richard didn't celebrate publicly. They drove home in silence, but with a quiet peace inside them. That night, Luna showed Julia a drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands. "It's us," she said. Julia smiled. The road had been hard, but they had made it together, and they were just getting started. Dr. Atticus Morrow was officially convicted. The court found him guilty of illegal medical practices, including using unapproved medications on children without proper consent. He was sentenced to prison, and the companies involved were fined and banned from producing similar compounds. News of the conviction spread across the country. The case had brought awareness to thousands of families, and changes were made to how medical trials were approved and monitored. But for Richard, Julia, and Luna, the most important part was that it was finally over. The chapter of fear and silence had ended. They could now focus entirely on healing. Richard took a step back from his business and spent more time at home. Julia remained fully present, continuing to guide Luna with patience and love. And Luna, who once sat in silence holding a teddy bear, was now moving forward. With the help of a child development specialist, she was officially enrolled in a regular elementary school with a custom learning plan. It was the start of a new life, one full of movement, people, and bright colors. The first days at school were a mix of excitement and nervousness. Luna had never been in a classroom before. Julia went with her to meet the teacher, who had already read her file and knew about her vision progress. They introduced Luna to the class, slowly, giving her time to adjust. At first, she stayed quiet and stayed close to Julia, unsure of the noise and constant motion around her. But within a few days, things began to change. She started answering questions, raising her hand and joining group activities. She was fascinated by things other kids had taken for granted, like colors on the board, pictures in books, and even the way chalk left marks on the blackboard. Julia would pick her up every afternoon, and Luna would talk non-stop on the way home. "Did you know blue and green are my favorite together?" she said once. Her words came faster, her eyes brighter. Richard listened with pride each evening. The little girl he once feared might never engage with the world was now fully part of it. Months passed quickly. Luna made new friends and continued improving in every subject, especially art. Her teachers said she had a unique way of understanding shapes and colors. Julia often found sketches stuffed into her backpack, houses, animals, faces, sometimes just abstract color swirls. Every picture told a story. At home, Richard turned one of the rooms into a mini studio just for her. It had shelves full of paints, pencils, and paper. Luna spent hours there after school. She liked working with music on, usually something soft in the background. Julia sat nearby, sometimes helping with supplies, but mostly just watching. Luna didn't need direction anymore. She had found her rhythm. Then, one day, an official letter arrived. It was from a National Children's Foundation. Luna had been selected to receive a special medal, an honor given to children who had shown strength in difficult situations. Along with the medal, she would be named an ambassador for resilient childhood, encouraging other kids to keep going no matter what. The ceremony would happen at a large event in the city. The day of the ceremony arrived. Julia helped Luna into a soft yellow dress, her favorite color. Richard wore a dark suit but had a flower pin in the same shade as Luna's dress. They arrived early and were guided backstage. Other children were also receiving honors, but Luna's name was last on the list. The host of the event gave a warm speech about children overcoming hard beginnings. When Luna's name was called, she walked calmly across the stage, holding Julia's hand. The applause was loud and full of love. A volunteer placed the medal gently around her neck. Then something unexpected happened. The host turned to the audience and said they had one more recognition to give. To the woman who stood by her when no one else did, who believed in light when everything seemed dark. Today we recognize Julia Bennett as Luna's adoptive mother and lifelong guardian. Julia froze for a moment, surprised. Then she stepped forward, tears in her eyes. Luna hugged her tightly. The crowd stood and applauded again. It was a moment they would never forget. Years passed. Luna grew into a confident teenager with a clear purpose. She kept drawing, painting, and learning more about art every day. Her teachers described her as focused, kind, and talented. She used her story as motivation and often spoke to other children going through difficult times. By the time she turned 18, Luna had been accepted to an art academy. She moved into a small apartment in the city, but Julia and Richard remained close. They visited often and helped her set up a real studio. Luna began working on a series of paintings inspired by her childhood. She wanted to show her journey, not just the pain, but the discovery and joy too. A few years later, she held her first public art exhibition in a local gallery. It featured 15 paintings, each one named after a moment that changed her life. Friends, teachers, and even the journalist who once told her story came to see. The gallery was packed. Luna stood in front of a microphone and prepared to give a short speech. She looked out at the audience, took a breath, and began speaking. Her voice was calm and steady. She thanked her teachers, friends, and supporters. Then she paused and looked at Julia, who stood beside Richard near the front row. "People often ask me when I saw light for the first time," Luna said. "They expect me to talk about flashlights or sunlight or my first drawing. But the truth is, the first light I ever saw didn't come from my eyes. It came from her heart." She pointed to Julia. The room went completely silent for a few seconds. Julia covered her mouth, moved to tears. The crowd slowly began to clap, some already crying. Richard placed his arm around Julia's shoulder. That night, the gallery stayed full until closing. Luna's art sold quickly, but more than the colors or strokes, people came for the story behind it. A story of truth, love, and second chances. And in the center of it all was Luna, no longer just the silent girl, but the artist who had learned to see. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.